Hi, this is Professor JPS, and this is a lecture for Communication Arts 205, Mass Media and Pop Culture, and we're discussing Chapter 4, Sociological Analysis. So in this chapter, what I'm trying to do in this streamlined lecture is go through the pages of the textbook that I want to filter out for you that are the most important and most valuable, and also want to describe some of the aspects of this particular chapter that could be a little difficult to gather and grasp without discussing it some. And this will be part 1 of this particular unit, chapter 4. Chapter 4 is fairly lengthy and has a good deal of information about sociological analysis, which is fairly broad and encompassing aspect of this particular unit of the course. So this is Tuesday evening, March 31st. It's for the April 1st class, which we normally meet at 11:30 a.m., but I'm getting it uploaded the evening before, so you can have it for Wednesday through to next Monday. This particular unit, sociological chapter, will probably take several parts on the YouTube channel. So anyway, so let's get to it. Right on the first page of the chapter, page 135, Berger, the textbook author, discusses core concepts and processes for the 4 social sciences. And what he has here is right on this particular page, he has a box right on here that's very useful. And I will discuss some of these aspects. And if you have time, you can at least get the 4 across the top: sociology, psychology, political science, and anthropology. These are the 4 here right across the top. Now you can just use the textbook yourself, but for those of you, I know still some of you don't have the textbook, I want to give you a sense of what's being written there. So it's on page 135. And what Berger's trying to get at is give you a spectrum of analysis with these 4 aspects of what are called social sciences. Social sciences are slightly different than so-called hard sciences. Hard sciences meaning like biology or chemistry, those kinds of things that are usually done in a lab with a kind of finite mathematical and more of an aspect that's quantifiable. Social sciences are a little different. Social sciences are studying essentially the entirety of culture, and the 4 social sciences that make the most sense for our purposes in this particular chapter are sociology, psychology, political science, and anthropology. Okay? And in terms of each of those has beneath it a core concept and also a process. So let's just take the first one first. Sociology. The core concept for sociology has to do with the notion of groups and institutions. So when you're learning about sociology, you're learning about groups and their institutions. You may be learning about the ways in which certain kinds of groups in, say, our culture behave, maybe children or teenagers or the elderly. You're looking at the way in which people live out their whole lives. So the core concept for sociology are groups and institutions. And the process is something called socialization, how people encounter one another, how people understand one another, how people react with one another. Okay? So sociology is, of course, much larger, much broader than this. But in terms of our discussion here, just getting a kind of taste of what sociology is about, the core concept have to do with groups and institutions, and the process has to do with socialization, which is just a fancy word of saying getting to know and understand people. Item 2 is psychology. Psychology is, according to Berger, the second of the core social sciences. And the core concept, or the sort of method or the idea, has to do with the psyche or consciousness, studying about what it is that we know and understand and think, understanding our psyche and our consciousness. Now, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about psychoanalytic theory and the id, the ego, and the superego. But I think it's pretty easy to understand the idea that psychology studies the psyche and what's behind our consciousness and also subconsciousness. The third core concept for Berger is something called political science. You've probably heard of political science and have some sense of what it means having to do with politics. The core concept for political science is power and government. Okay, now that's relatively easy to understand. I don't think we think enough about power and government in our culture and how it is that people get power and attain power and sustain power. Political science is one of the major aspects of social science that looks at how people get and utilize power in government, and that can be local government, can be state government, can be national and international government. And for the process of political science, it has to do with the idea of indoctrination. Indoctrination. And indoctrination means how it is that you come to understand your place in a particular society, the themes and values you're taught within a particular government. So, for instance, from childhood, we're told to do the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. We're indoctrinated to believe that capitalism is the best system. We're indoctrinated to believe that the American military is the best. And in fact, they probably are, and capitalism probably is. But it becomes a system of belief that's taught to us on a routinized basis. That's what indoctrination means. Indoctrination often has a kind of negative connotation. It doesn't necessarily have to. We're indoctrinated in all kinds of different ways to believe the things that we believe, whether they have to do with politics or not. I mean, we're indoctrinated in terms of fashion, or indoctrinated in terms of sports teams we like to root for. We're indoctrinated in terms of how it is that romance is constructed and represented in culture and rom-com movies. We're indoctrinated in many different ways. But specifically for political science, indoctrination has to do with the idea of learning and repeating values and themes that the government, the institutions of power, display for us. And the fourth social science aspect has to do with something called anthropology. Anthropology, and that's really studying culture. So the core concept in anthropology is culture. And culture is a rather broad term, and there's a guy called Raymond Williams, a British theoretician, who I think described culture well. He said it's a whole way of life. And that's for everybody, whether it's a culture that's far away in the South Seas, or whether it's a culture of people in South Norwalk, or whether it's a culture of people in, far away Antarctica. It's the way in which it encompasses everything, anthropology. And the core concept of culture, of anthropology, is culture, how it is that people live their lives from a variety of perspectives. And the process of something called enculturization, which is just a fancy word of saying how people live their lives, okay? So Berger puts it in a kind of nice box for us to look at on page 135. For those of you who have your textbooks and didn't lose them, or make sure you know where it is, it's right there in the box, and it's easy to understand. For those of you who haven't yet gotten the textbook, or have misplaced your textbook, or God forbid left your textbook somewhere else, I think I went over them relatively steadily. So as I said before, when you're watching some of these videos, since I don't really have a place to write down, I think that you should probably hit pause once in a while, listen to what I said, hit start, listen to what I said again. I'll try to speak relatively slowly to get people's understanding, so people can take a breath and understand what I was getting at, okay? Moving on from that concept, I want to get to a concept and a guy who was pretty smart on pages 136 and 137. 136 and 137 is a fellow called Emil Durkheim. And Emil Durkheim was a famous sociologist who was talking about the idea of the individual and the idea of the individual within society. Emil Durkheim was interested in society. He was interested in how it is that a person can have an individual life yet also be part of a society. And he referred to this as a kind of that everybody has a kind of double responsibility to themselves, but also to be a responsible person for the rest of society, that we're just one person and we're a member of society in one form or another. And he also was interested in thinking about how we become socialized in the world, how we come to understand the world in the ways we understand the world. And on the top of 137, there's a pretty rich passage in Berger that helps exemplify what Emil Durkheim was getting at. He says, according to Durkheim, the ideas we have are, to a large degree, shaped by what we are taught in school and by the way we are socialized by our peers, our parents, our religious figures, and our favorite pop stars, in fact. So there is a strong social dimension to our thinking that even if we believe that somehow we are, quote, self-made men and women, and that society is just an abstraction that has little impact on our lives, we should keep Durkheim's insight into the relationship between the individual and society in mind when we consider the role that the mass media play in our lives, in our societies. What Durkheim is getting at there is that, we're both an individual, but we're also part of a society. And that we're less self-made than we think we are. Yes, we're born into certain particular economic categories, and we all learn ways in which we're acculturated into our own culture. But much of what it is that we absorb for entertainment and to some degree education is produced for us to replicate that idea in society. So Durkheim is suggesting that there's an idea that we're less self-made than perhaps we think we are. We wouldn't know who we were without a consistent idea given to us by the society about who we should be, as replicated and represented in mass media. If you think about the current situation in terms of this idea of the sort of double identity that we have, that we're all individuals, but we're part of a society, I think in some ways you can see that makes very much sense in terms of this coronavirus problem. Because even if we feel fine, we should not go out, because we could be passing on something to other people without knowing it. Or we could be gathering a virus from someone without knowing it. And the more that everybody stays home, this individual stays here, it affects the society at large. I am one person, I stay at home, I'm one person who's not either unknowingly passing on symptoms or catching symptoms and bringing them into my home and crowding up hospitals with myself or my daughter or my wife. It doesn't take too much to think about the responsibility of the individual and his or her place within the greater society. So some of those ideas about Emil Durkheim on 136 and 137, and if you've had any social one-on-one courses, I'm sure you've heard a little bit about Emil Durkheim. Pushing ahead to 143 and 144, the idea of culture, just culture, a very broad term. Berger has a few different versions of culture here. And again, how culture is influenced by popular culture. Raymond Williams, the British theoretician, said culture is a whole way of life. Everything within that culture is part of a whole way of life for people, whether or not you're participating in that part of the culture or not. It is part of a culture. And he also mentions a fellow called Stuart Hall, who is also another British person, who was suggesting that that culture is not just a whole way of life, but so much of our culture is understood on how our culture is represented and re-represented via mass media / popular culture. And that is an interesting point. And I think, this chapter goes into a lot of things that I think that have less to do with media, But Stuart Hall was someone who's interested in how media replicates culture over and over and over again, and the things that become normalized through television, through film. And he was writing before the internet. But it's amazing if you think about how we understand our own sense of our own identity and self-worth with digital media, with our Facebook pages, with our Instagram pages, with the idea that our own identities are in this computer or on our phones so consistently that our self-worth in this culture is a mediated or media-related idea of culture. So Hall, who was writing well before digital media, he was writing in the 70s and into the 80s, he was someone who was ahead of his time in saying that culture is not just everything in the culture, but culture as replicated and represented through films and television and pop songs, and certainly in this day and age, digital media. It becomes a kind of interesting idea about how it's a cultural feedback loop of representation and re-representation vis-a-vis television, film, and digital media and the like. That information can be looked over on 143 and 144. Okay, 143 and 144. Then Berger goes on and on to talk a little bit about some of the aspects of some sociological analysis that's okay, but I don't think that important for our purposes in this particular idea. And I want to get to something that can be a little bit difficult to get a handle on pages 152 and 153, and just a little bit of 154. That's 152, 153, and 154. And that's something called postmodernism. Postmodernism it's an interesting idea, but it will require some explanation on my part for you. And it can be a little bit difficult to grasp, and I'll try my best this evening to discuss this idea of postmodernism. If you stay with me and you don't nod off too badly, or if you want to put me on pause for a minute and grab a coffee or soda or something, I don't know. I want you to understand that there's a point to understanding postmodernism, and the point to understanding postmodernism, or at least the sort of essential idea of postmodernism, is you must first understand what the point is. Why I'm bothering to discuss this stuff. The general idea of postmodernism really has to do with how we absorb and understand art/aesthetics. How we understand art/aesthetics. Aesthetics is the study of beauty, and art is art and has to do with beauty. And some of the reference points I may make, you might not have had a class in some of these things yet. You might not have studied art history or poetry. Not that I'm any expert on art history or poetry. I just have a Penn State education, which was a good one, but I'm no expert on it. But I just want you to understand that there's an end point to this that hopefully you'll understand. And I think that when I finally get to postmodernism, and I think with hip hop music, I think you'll see what I mean. But just stay with me on this idea of what postmodernism is. In order to get at postmodernism, we first have to kind of think about what might be considered pre-modern art. And then we must consider what modern art was. And then we must consider what postmodern art is. So again, this is not the end all or be all, or like, a lecture that's going to be given to you by an expert on pre-modern art or modern art. Just the basics here, okay? If we just say, roughly speaking, I don't know, about the 1500s to about the 1900s, let's just say. And again, this is all Western culture. This has little to do with the East or Asian culture or anything. Greek culture in West, European culture, and then later American culture. Forgive my Western chauvinism, but it has to do with the idea of culture in the West. When I say the West, I mean from Greece west. I don't mean, Arizona or something. So if you think about art, the impulse of art and aesthetics, roughly speaking, from about 1500 to 1900, classical art, classical statues, classical paintings, classical music, classical poetry, the impulse and all of that stuff, the reason for it, the basic understanding of it with rich or poor people alike, was that it was about unity and beauty. Okay? The impulse in pre-modern art was about beauty, was about making a picture of something that looked beautiful and resembled the thing that it was supposed to be in real life. That audiences, both rich patrons and poor people alike, could recognize the thing that was being painted, could recognize the thing that was being sculpted, could recognize or to some degree understand the poetic sensibility of a poem, could hear the music and be moved by its beauty. That the impulse of pre-modern art was about unity and clarity and beauty, and that it was something easily understood, or at least reasonably easily understood. Okay? I mean, this is a simplistic example, but if you see the picture of the Mona Lisa, you can see that the woman is lovely and she has this kind of quiet smirk on her face, and maybe that's suggesting some sensuality, and maybe it was daring for the time period. But, it doesn't look like the vision of beauty today. The vision of beauty today is much more sexualized and silly and superficial. But if you look at the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper or the Sistine Chapel or Michelangelo's sculpted David, it's an idealized version of beauty, and it's easily understandable. If you hear classical music from the great masters, Verdi or Mozart or whomever, it may bore you because you're more interested in popular music, but still you can recognize that it's resonant, that it sounds nice, that it sounds pretty, that it's in, movies, or, sometimes you'll hear it in backgrounds of commercials, and it's not displeasing to the ear. Okay, so that's kind of what I mean by pre-modern art. And the Renaissance, which happens in the 15th and 16th century, you get this outstanding period of European art that's celebrating beauty, celebrating the human, even though much of it is liturgical or theological or religious, but it's celebrating unity, clarity, beauty. Okay, so that's pre-modern. Around 1900, let's just say roughly speaking, and again, I'm not an expert on this, I'm a film guy, but around 1900 to about, let's say about 1960 or so, in Europe and in America, you have what's much more something called modernism, modern art. Modern art does away with the pre-modern impulse to beauty. Now, not that some of it isn't beautiful, but the modernists came along and they were like, yeah, all those paintings and those poetry and that music, it was all lovely. And certainly there were a lot of masters, and you can't take away from their efforts. But in their minds, it was sort of maybe too corny, too played out, as you kids might say, right? I don't know. And modernists, their work was much more intellectual and abstract. Now, you've probably heard of abstract painting and seen some abstract painting and understand it to be like messy and weird and, oh, my 5-year-old brother can do a better job, that kind of stuff when you see modern painting. Now, I'm no expert on modern painting, but what I'm getting at is the impulse in modernism was to do away with unity and clarity. And it was a much more abstract and intellectualized idea about art. It was sort of thinking about art in a kind of way that was not to necessarily please the art viewer or the reader or the listener, but it was to challenge the very notion of what was seen as artistic. Some classical music went from being really pretty to, with a resonant sound to a kind of dissonant sound, to dare the listener to hear something that was different than it had been for centuries. You probably have heard of someone called Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso did paint what you might consider normal representative paintings in his earlier period that were about beautiful, clear, understandable paintings. But then he was the most famous modern artist painter of all time after that, in the 20s and through to his death in, I think, the late 60s. And his figures were there; they had all kinds of weird shapes to them, because he was bored with just doing paintings that looked like the thing it was supposed to represent. And his most famous painting is a painting called Guernica, that's about the horrors of Nazis dropping bombs on civilians in a Spanish town called Guernica. And if you look at the painting, it's not a realistic painting at all, but it conveys this sense of doom and terror, even though it's all abstract. Okay, it's an abstract painting. And sometimes you had some literature people who were writing stories within stories within stories that were harder to understand, but it was almost about the practice of writing rather than about the stories itself. And even in architecture, modern architecture became slightly different than architecture in the previous century. Architecture in the 19th century was much more flowery and powerful. In the 20th century, it was sort of anonymous and boxy, okay? So modernism does away with unity, does away with clarity, right? It challenges the very notion of what can be considered beautiful or acceptable. Modernism had guts to some degree, okay? And sometimes it would put off people, I guess regular people, because they didn't understand it. I mean, they could understand the Mona Lisa, right? It looks like a pretty woman, and perhaps there's something going on there that you can learn about in terms of the context of the times. But I can understand, Michelangelo's David. It's an idealized version of a human being who is a biblical hero, and he's beautiful. Whereas modernism challenged those very notions of what was supposed to be depicted. Postmodernism, which, depending upon who you talk to and what field, happens in the latter part of the 20th century, 70s, 80s, 90s. Postmodernism is a way to have a modern impulse and a pre-modern impulse sort of combined together. There's a wonderful professor, I think he's at Columbia, he was in the West Coast for many years, called Todd Gitlin. He was a terrific writer and a very good man, a good citizen of the world, who said that modernism broke the glass of pre-modernism, and postmodernism is playing with the shards of the broken glass. Postmodernism is a collage of both pre-modern and modern impulses in art. It's a kind of combination of the two elements. That's what postmodernism is, right? If you think, my best example to make it tangible for you, if you think of the idea of sampling in pop rap music, right? Now, I don't listen to that much rap. I've heard much of it over the years, but it just doesn't speak to my experience. I feel too stupid, really, and too white for it somehow, and just old. And anyway, I mean, I appreciate rap artists, but it's just I would feel like a fool or fronting if to be down with that. But at any rate, if you think about what the impulse is for a sample in a rap song, what is it? It's a song that's recognizable, right? It's a tune that you've heard somewhere before in your life, right? And then that tune is placed into some sort of beat or groove for the actual song, the rap song that's going to be played. So if you think about the idea of pre-modern, which is clarity, recognizability, understandability, And then if you think about that as the sample, that's a pre-modern thing. And then if you think about rap music itself is a relatively modern enterprise, but the combination of those two things is a postmodern feel. Because postmodernism, more so than anything else, depends upon awareness of the past, depends upon using prior ingredients, particularly in popular culture, to help push along the thing that they're trying to push along. And if you think about rap music, and particularly with sampling, sampling is a callback to the past that's situated to the rap groove or the rap message that's going to be in that hip hop song, that hip hop song. That is a very postmodern idea. Okay? Rap music with sampling is a postmodern idea because it's pulling from the past and centering it to the then contemporary present. So on one ear, you're hearing something long ago, and on the other ear, you're hearing something new. That's the essence, in some ways, of what postmodernism is in popular culture. If you think about filmmakers, right? There's some interesting filmmakers, but I think the most purely postmodern filmmaker is Quentin Tarantino. For those of you who are Tarantino fans, Tarantino's films are nothing if they're not pulling from the past, right? Virtually all of his films have some semblance of film fandom and awareness of film fandom from different genres, whether they're kung fu films for Kill Bill, whether they're old gangster films for Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs, whether they're old sort of exploitation films from the 70s for some of his films like Grindhouse. Some of you ever seen that one? Some old African-American films about the difficulties of American slavery, and it's placed into Django Unchained, or the Inglourious Basterds films. I mean, Inglourious Basterds films, he's giving characters names of people who were in other films in the 1940s and 50s. Okay? Tarantino's characters, they're not real people in any sense. Now, I don't say that as a criticism. I say that as a celebration. Even his last film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, is a smorgasbord of collection of details that are so precise to Los Angeles in 1969 that it's amazing, right? And he completely rewrites history. He doesn't care about history. I mean, in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that's not how that happened. In Inglourious Basterds, that's not how World War II happened. Django Unchained is just this crazy story where in reality he would be caught by the Ku Klux Klan 5 minutes after he left Candyland. But it doesn't matter because it's all excess fun with the forms of older films that are being played with in a very postmodern way. Okay? His characterizations have little to do with realism. His characters are all movie caricatures from another era and another genre, really. And he takes those ingredients and he puts them into this postmodern mix with a pre-modern impulse for clarity and a modernist impulse to blow up that clarity. And that's what he does in his movies. See, that's what we mean by postmodernism. Okay? It's taking a pre-modern impulse of clarity and unity, a modern impulse of destroying that unity, and putting those two things together. That's what postmodernism is. And sometimes you'll see it in music, sometimes you'll see it in television, sometimes you'll see it in filmmaking. There's a pretty good example of architecture too, even though I'm no expert in architecture, but just to give you a sense of what I mean. There's a building in downtown Manhattan called the AT&T building, okay? Now, it's a building that was done by a guy called Philip Johnson in the 70s. I think it was the 70s. Now, the building itself has a very modernist body from the first floor to whatever, nearly the top. And it's just very basic modernist sensibility for architecture, modernist sensibility. It's very sterile. It's relatively boring. And at the very top of the building, I don't know, 4 or 5 floors, there's this 18th century sort of very strange top that has this beautiful curved bow, and it looks completely different than the rest of the building. What he did there was put an older 19th century from the 1800s top on top of a 50s, 60s style, modern, sleek, sterile looking building, and put them both together. And the architectural world just had their jaws drop because they were like, what is this? This is a combination of two elements. It's sort of what postmodernism is, if you think about it. It's when you get tired of being modern, right? You get tired of playing the modern card. It's when modernism gets played out, if you like. Just like pre-modern impulse got played out and was replaced by modernism. And then postmodernism comes along and says, let's play with both sides of those impulses, okay? It happens with rap music. It happens with architecture. It happens with filmmaking. I'm sure it happens in other areas that I don't know enough about. I don't know, like sculpture and poetry. I don't know. I'm not that skilled in those kinds of other forms of humanities. It's a little bit hard to fathom, but if you read through pages 152, 153, they talk a little bit about postmodernism, and my man Todd Gitlin gives you the best quote there on pages 152 and 153, okay? So this is the end of what will be just what would have been Wednesday, April 1st's lecture, even though this is, it's still March 31st. This will be for tomorrow, for Wednesday, April 1st. And then next Monday, we will continue with this particular chapter. Perhaps I'll put a video up this weekend. And I want you to pay attention to pages I've already gone through, but also I want you to pay careful attention to pages 164 through 174. Yes, 164 through 174. Okay, and probably over the next Monday and next Wednesday, we'll probably finish up that chapter between next Monday and next Wednesday. And please email me questions. If I'm not projecting well enough, or if I'm going too fast, or if my voice is just not working or something, just email me questions. Let me know. I think I'm trying to go slowish so you can pause, write some things down. I'm giving you the page numbers. I'm trying to equate as much as I can in classroom without asking you questions or telling a story about this or that, which I'm seeing now takes up a lot of time. And email me some questions, and please let me know. Please, please, please go to your NCC emails. I think that's very, very important, okay? And also, just please stay safe. You have to take this seriously, really seriously. You've probably seen it by now that Norwalk, the town of Norwalk, has been hit quite hard, as has Fairfield County. Do not think because you're 20 years old, everything's going to be fine. A lot of people have been hospitalized who are in their 20s and 30s. Stay home as much as you can. If you're a person who's working, I know I have some students who work at supermarkets. God bless, but get as much hand sanitizer as you can. And if you're also working in other jobs, I don't know, just make sure you're treating it seriously. Don't just think everything's going to be okay. This is unprecedented. Well, happened 102 years ago, but other than that, you're going to be talking about this spring and maybe this summer when you're an old man and an old woman. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. So do not kid yourself, okay? Do not kid yourself. If you have to go out to the Stop and Shop or the post office or whatever, man, wash your hands and wash them really well. Don't just kid around. Wash them really well. And, wipe down doorknobs and so forth. Okay? Be well. It's funny, it seems so strange to teach this way. I miss the classroom a lot, but we'll get through this all together, okay? And just make sure that you're paying attention to the work you need to do in your workspace in your house, okay? Because it's taken me a lot to get used to this. I'm so used to the classroom and just talking with students. All right. I'll speak to this particular class probably over the weekend again. Bye-bye.